Hi folks, you're very welcome to the Science Gallery this evening. We're delighted to welcome you to the third in our series as part of our exhibition, Fake. Tonight's talk is all about art, the art of faking it, which probes the proliferation of fakes in the art world. From forgeries and frauds to masters of deception, the animal kingdom isn't the only place where you find deception. We're delighted to have Dominic Milmo-Penny, who's an expert art historian and art dealer, who's going to contextualize fake with a capital F. I'd love for you to welcome Dominic to the stage, and we'll get kicked off. Yeah, thanks.
So, thank you very much, Ola, and thank you all for coming. Nice to see so many of you here. And I think before I begin, I think I should really commend the Science Gallery here for putting on, not just this evening, but for putting on this whole exhibition, because this is a subject that most institutions don't want to touch, not even with a barge pole. We won't mention our national newspapers. They lead the charge when it comes to not wanting to know. So, they've given me a little machine here. So, I hope most of you have seen this painting on the way in and have had a close look, followed by the white prompts on the board. There's a question really as to whether this painting should be in a fake exhibition. Well, it should for various reasons. But there's nothing fake about the actual painting itself. This painting was painted in about 1860, obviously by a very, very fine painter, just on stylistic grounds and looking at the back of the canvas and various measurements and other little clues. We're pretty certain that this was painted by a French artist around about 1860, a French painter who was working not so much in a group, but there was a trend or a fashion in France around about this time to paint, not so much copy, but to paint in the style or in the manner of some of the great painters and the great flower painters, in particular of the 1750s, the golden age in Dutch painting. And whoever turned this genuine painting into a forgery, they were very clever because they chose a really, really fine painting which isn't a million miles away from what the original artist would have painted. So let's just go through step by step and we'll see what's happened to this painting. So the original artist in 1860, let's settle on that date for the sake of argument, signed this painting with his or her signature. And our forger friend sometime later came along, and the first thing he did was, here we're looking at the bottom left-hand corner of the painting, where the forger gouges away the signature of the original artist. So he now has a blank canvas to work with. You can also see a fair amount of discoloration. That this is a very almost blackish brown, which is overpaint. And we can just see around the edges of the illustration a chocolatey brown color, which is part of the original paint. Now, my suspicion here is that the forger, who, as we see in the next shot, paints on a very, very, very nicely done signature with a date. He's obviously very skilled and wouldn't have left this particular forgery in such a clumsy state where it's patently obvious, even to the naked eye, that something funny has gone on here. So my guess is that at some stage, a later owner of the painting, maybe he brings it, maybe he tries to sell it or brings it to a gallery or something, and he's told, no, this isn't the real thing. And some investigative work is done, and at that stage, the filling which would have been used to disguise the gouging was removed, and they just never bothered to refill it, and they then just overpainted the area with this not very well matching dark paint. So here we can see how well done, I referred earlier to the skill of the forger. This is very nicely done, and it's very, very close to Rachel Rouse's original signature, and the date, very cleverly chosen. The date matches with what she was doing at that particular time. So, the really good forgers, they're never happy just to add on a signature. The really crafty ones, they invent a provenance. Especially for paintings of high value, it's almost impossible to sell a painting of a high value without a provenance. And in fact, in the authentication of paintings, it's almost at the top of the list. Provenance is often loosely referred to, the painting has a great provenance. It was in the Guinness collection for the last 150 years, but there's 50 years missing before that. So that sort of provenance, don't even bother mentioning it, because it's just a waste of time. The only provenance that has any value in the description of a painting, or any other artwork for that matter, is an unbroken provenance. And these will usually be documented. There will be valuations or house inventories or whatever, or maybe even studio records, going right back to the artist. And if you haven't got that, well, if you've been asked to spend a lot of money, well, turn your back, walk away, go somewhere else. So the provenance that's created here is very clever, but it's almost too good. Because if you look at the back of this painting and examine it carefully, you see immediately that they don't match. The painting and the frame don't match. The size is completely wrong, and you can see lots of nail marks and pin marks, which just don't make sense. So what this very clever forger has done is he has taken a frame which is a very genuine frame. This frame used to house a painting. We've no idea which painting it might have been, but a painting from the collection of Queen Adelaide, who was on the throne in the 1730s. So it's a great provenance. If you're trying to sell a Rachel Rouse, if part of your story is this painting used to belong to the Queen and she gave it away to the housemaid when she was leaving or whatever, then you're on a real winner, especially if you've got a sucker as a buyer. But very easy just to take a painting and match it up with a canvas of the same size, and the real value, the forger here would have attributed more value to this frame than he did to. Well, it was a great match to have a painting that matched so closely to Rachel Rouse, and a frame that would help to seal the deal. So in value, the painting hanging outside is probably worth 1,500. If we can identify the French artist, which we would be able to if we spent enough time on it, might be worth 10 or 15,000. If it was the real thing, if it was a Rachel Rouse, this painting would be worth $1.5 million or pounds or euros, doesn't really matter. So you can see why someone would go to so much trouble. And I've no doubt somebody made money out of this at some stage along the road. I'm not sure if they made $1.5 million. We don't know when the deception took place or when it changed hands, but there you are. So the reason I offered this painting to the exhibition on loan was because, first of all, it's mine. painting I bought, knowing exactly what I was buying. I like flower paintings, I like French paintings, I like Dutch paintings. So this I bought for my own wall. So nobody is going to sue Science Gallery or Trinity College because of what's being said about their painting. The only person going to sue them is me, and make a pretty poor case. If that went before a judge, well, you'd probably say, well, you shouldn't have said what you said about your painting. So next case, please. So, but the reason I thought it would make a good exhibit is because we can see it as a template, if that's the right word, or if you will see, I could describe 50 or 60 or 200 paintings and more, and you'll find that I seem to be saying the same thing all the time. Painting after painting after painting, I'm talking about gouged signatures. They're not always gouged. Sometimes the signature can be just removed with solvent. Sometimes the original artist wouldn't have signed the painting, so that's really easy. We'll see an example of that later, if we get that far. How do we detect these things? There's lots of very, very simple ways. An eyeglass, a jeweler's eyeglass with anything between 5 and 10 times magnification. That's my first tool. I never go anywhere to look at a painting without an eyeglass in my pocket, never. And that, for me, is normally enough. I normally don't need any more than 10 times magnification, because it's quite extraordinary what you can see with an eyeglass, the difference between that and looking with the naked eye. It's very often, it's very, very difficult, especially if something's behind glasses, to tell the difference between a watercolor and a print. Take a simple eyeglass out of your pocket and you'll see immediately. Because if it's a print, you'll see the little screen dots that the plate maker made up. So a very, very valuable tool. But moving on from there, my next tool, and again, I would have, in fact, I had to take it out of my bag just as I left, because I didn't realize it was in my bag. But I never go anywhere to look at paintings without a UV light, an ultraviolet light. You probably have come across UV lights yourselves in petrol stations, where you have a guy who runs a light over the 50-euro banknote. So what you can tell with UV light, if there is a recent addition to the medium, it will show up, the addition will show up in a very strange color, dark, normally dark, purplish, but it depends. It really depends on how long the addition has been there and what the medium is. So a signature added to a painting recently, put a UV light over it, and it will jump out. But not all the time, because the more clever forger, they have various masks and varnishes, pigmented varnishes, that they can paint over the added signature, which will block out the UV rays. So that's, in a lot of cases, it can give you a good indication. UV light shows up in addition. Can also show up lots of restoration. Mostly we don't want to buy restored paintings. Bit more technical, infrared light. We'll see, I think, in the second painting we're going to look at, where infrared light really saved a client of mine €250,000, simple infrared photograph. That's a bit more scientific. When I talk about infrared light, I don't mean the light that you'd use to keep your chickens warm or anything like that. It would probably melt the painting if you put it in front of it. Now, this is slightly specialist equipment, but it's available. Really professional photographers or people really specializing in scientific analysis, they would have really, really fine equipment, and it just gets better and better each day. So it gets more and more difficult for the forger to succeed. In fact, almost impossible for him to succeed these days. We had got to infrared light. X-rays then. X-rays are useful, but only in a limited sense. Normally, we don't bother with X-rays until something's going into court, and you really need as much evidence as you can. And mostly with X-rays, we're talking about old master paintings rather than modern. And the only real value in X-rays can often show up a drawing underneath a painting, and you can get all sorts of information if you can get access to the drawing, which is obscured by the painting. And it can be useful for ruling in or out various pigments. One of the real values with X-ray is, as we all know, can't pass through lead. And a lot of the old masters use a lot of lead in their paint mixes, especially in their whites. So it will be a bit lower down the list. After that, we really get into the laboratory, where you're talking about pigment analysis and spectroscopy. And these particular sciences, they are just staggering what the amount of information that they can give you today. They can analyze a pigment right down to the last micron. And from that, they can identify whether a paint or a particular pigment was in use at a certain date, which may or may not match whatever the date the pigment is supposed to be. So after that, I think I need a drop of water. And we'll move on to a painting which most of you probably know. She's already there. Did I do something, or did someone else do something? So, Goose, painting which belongs to us, National Gallery of Ireland. And it's regained its popularity, but back in the 90s, there was a lot of controversy over this painting. Prior to that, it was the most popular painting in the gallery. They sold literally images of all sorts by the million. They made more money out of this painting than they did out of everything else. And it's only now that it's becoming popular again. This painting actually went through almost identical processes in the hand of a forger as the painting hanging outside the Rachel Rouse. The painting was bought by the National Gallery in 1970 or thereabouts, sold by a young Dublin dealer in absolute innocence. He was thoroughly convinced that the painting was by William John Leach, quite a well-known Irish artist and quite a valuable artist, even in 1970. His problem, though, in 1970, I think there was only one book available on Irish art, Strickland's Dictionary of Irish Artists, which stopped at about, I don't know, 1900 or so. Certainly you won't find an entry on William John Leach. But it's quite different today. There's any number of books, not just on Irish artists, but any number of books on William John Leach. But some very, very simple mistakes were made, some silly mistakes, you'd have to say, some naive mistakes, not just on the part of the dealer who sold the painting, but whoever sold it to him probably sold it also in innocence. There was an extraordinary reliance made on a very simple paper label which was stuck to the frame, not the painting. And that's vital because this painting is 28 by 36 inches. It's about as standard a size as you can get. So a frame like that will, in its lifetime, might change from painting to painting to painting, especially if it's going through dealer's hands. A frame can change paintings 10 times, or 20 by 24, any of these standard sizes. So the attribution was made on the label on the frame, not on the painting. And the label, well, it's impossible to say whether the label was just genuinely stuck to a painting with a relationship to another frame, or stuck on the frame with a relationship to another painting, or if it was somebody really clever who took this paper label and put just enough information for a case to be made for the painting being by William John Leach. So the label simply had initials WL, William Leach, and then it gave the name Camperlé, which is a town in France which a lot of Irish painters painted in. So that was the first really silly mistake, because this, if you look at any Breton paintings, the Breton dress is so distinctive. And there are literally 100 and more versions of it as you move from region to region. But still in all, Breton costume is distinctive. Camperlé costume is distinctive. And just take one look at this painting, and you can see that this is not French dress. It's not Breton dress. But it's absolutely just screaming England. This bonnet was worn the length and breadth of England by girls out herding geese or working on farms or whatever. So that was the real telltale, and just nobody spotted it. Really silly. What's even more silly is rather than look at this flimsy label, they should have been looking on the back of the canvas. There was a stamp, a circular stamp, 6 inches wide, which was, our television has gone. It'll come back, I'm sure. The stamp gave the name of Hibbert Brothers in Sheffield. So that's screaming out to anyone who wanted to ask worthwhile questions. Well, was Stanley Royal in Sheffield? Did he work from there? Did he buy his supplies there? Well, no, he's an Irish painter. He worked in England, all right, but no real connection with Sheffield. But Hibbert Brothers in 1970 were still in business. There was a phone book or directory. You could phone directory inquiries. Can you give me the number of Hibbert Brothers in Sheffield? Send me a photograph, they would have said, and they would have, with just a photograph, they would have said, no, this painting is by Stanley Royal. It was the Hibbert Brothers. They weren't only canvas suppliers and artist suppliers. They also ran an upstairs gallery, a bit like Kennedy's in Harcourt Street, and Hibbert Brothers used to run exhibitions of Stanley Royal's work. And I eventually went to Sheffield in the middle of the controversy, and I spoke to the various people in the museums and in the libraries, and I spoke to Hibbert Brothers themselves, and the photograph wasn't even out of my pocket. They had no reason why I was there. They said, oh, this is very nice. I don't know this painting. Where'd you get this? And they immediately, without even mentioning the word Stanley Royal, they could see at a glance this is a Stanley Royal. So I'm not really.
Sorry, Dominic, we're just having some technical issues. We'll have it back on 2 seconds. Okay?
Yeah, don't worry.
Thank you.
So how did I become involved in the National Gallery's Goose Girl? Well, it was well known around the Dublin trade, and well known for a long time. For a good 10 or 15 years, there was casual debates about the Goose Girl painting and Leach, and well, it almost became a joke because we all knew the painting just couldn't be by Leach because the style was so completely removed to anything else that he'd painted. This is a problem, but it's a problem for the gallery, it's a problem for any institution, and it's just a problem in general for students or anyone who's interested or collectors. Anyone with an interest in an artist, if a National Gallery has as a main exhibit something that isn't by the artist it's supposed to be, well then how can anyone possibly form a proper overview of what this artist produced in his lifetime? So that's why the National Gallery were delighted to have this cleared up. For that reason and for lots of other reasons. But it took a long time. I think this controversy really, I think in all it took about, the gallery themselves would have known for a good 10 years that they had a problem on their hands. But they were in a very odd position because too many people involved, and there was talk of litigation and all of the rest. So they couldn't change the attribution unless they had, not just concrete proof, unless they had something really, really concrete to go on. So I became involved inadvertently. I think, and if we move on to the next image now that we have them back, is this thing working? Yeah, this is a painting called The Lilac Bonnet, also by Stanley Royal. And I was viewing a sale in Sotheby's in London in 1983 and walked into one of the galleries and was immediately drawn by this painting, and I stood in front of it and I just couldn't believe the similarity between this and our Goose Girl. So I became absolutely convinced that our painting was by Stanley Royal. That was 1983. I think it was 1996 or around about that time. Another painting, which I think, yes, will come up next. It's a painting called Spring Morning in the Bluebell Woods. Came up at Christie's in South Kensington. One morning hadn't seen the catalogue, got a phone call from a journalist, Ian Baird, from the Irish Independent. Dominic, have you seen the painting turning up in South Kensington? No, so he sent me an image, phoned me again, and he said, do you think this painting is by the same artist as the Goose Girl? And I said, yes. And he said, well, can I quote you on that? Yes, I said. And that was it. There was I was then involved. And I was threatened by various people who were involved in the controversy. And it was clear that I had to go out and it was clear that my reputation and my livelihood was under threat, so I went out and I did proper research, which took me to Sheffield and the rest. So I won't say the rest is history, but apart from the stamp, there was so much evidence there, even without anyone doing any in-depth research, so much evidence pointing to Stanley Royal. But to begin with, Royal did a series of paintings over about 10 years. 4 of them featured his wife as a model. 3 of them were done in bluebell woods. We took each painting and we did scaled drawings of the 3 related paintings, and we dropped them over the Goose Girl. And in every case, the images just fell one over the other. So we didn't know at the time that he had used his wife as a model, but we discovered later it was his wife who modeled for all the 3 other paintings and the Goose Girl, the National Gallery painting. So that's sort of compelling evidence, but still not enough if you have a whole load of lawyers just ready to sue you, and that's the position the National Gallery were in. So the next shot is just another version of another one of the drawings we did. So how, in the end, did the gallery find enough courage to change the attribution? Well, it was just by chance. In 1996 or 1998, I think, the gallery had planned a retrospective exhibition of William John Leach, and they had no choice other than to include this painting, even though there was a very big question mark over it. Just before the exhibition, although the painting didn't really need it, just as a matter of course, the painting got a very light surface clean and a coat of varnish. And it was the coat of varnish which brought to light tiny fragments which remained from where Stanley Royal's name had been gouged out. There were fragments of 4 letters, but fortunately for us, there were 2 E's involved in the remnants, or remnants of 2 E's, and Stanley Royal had a particularly idiosyncratic, well, you know the word, a particular way of making an E, a bit like a Greek E. It was very, very stylized and very distinctive. And we had 2 samples of it. And that was enough. So I was I was asked to go into the gallery one morning. All of the conservators were there. The painting was on an easel. There were very large microscopes. The press were there. And these little fragments were blown up, and Royal's genuine and well-known signet was put up beside it. And I went to all of the various pointers, and the director, after about 5 minutes, turned to one of his assistants and instructed them to go and make up a new nameplate for the painting, that from there on in, this painting would be described in the gallery as Stanley Royal. So it's an interesting story, and I hope I've managed to get across how closely what happened to the Royal painting is practically similar to what happened to the Rachel Royce of the Rachel Rouse painting, and literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings that I've handled. So I'm a small dealer. So that might just give you some idea of the number of fake paintings in circulation that are going, passing through galleries and auction houses and all of the rest on a daily basis. So if you think the Stanley Royal was complex, this one gets a little bit trickier. And you might have to bear with me, because I really have to go into my notes here, because there are so many issues relating to this painting. But it's a good story. Again, this is a painting that I fell into by chance. A client of mine had come in, he'd sold property and he had come into a very large amount of money. The previous 30 years, he'd bought every single painting on his wall from me, but when he came by this money, he was advised by his bank to spend X% on this and X% on that, and X% on art, and that's, I never got to hear about that bit. So he went off on his own and broke one world record after another on, I won't mention the name of the artist because they were all genuine and sort of contemporary things, not one of my favorites. So, you can probably guess who it is, but anyway, he went off to London really to buy. He was living in Wicklow, and there was a Paul Henry for sale, which is supposed to be of the Wicklow Mountains. He even rented a plane. We couldn't identify the view. He even went as far as renting a plane and flying up and down the mountains, hoping that he would spot this view. So eventually I convinced him to give up, that it might be a Paul Henry, but it wasn't a Wicklow. So he believed me in the end. But he'd booked his ticket for the auction, and he went over anyway. And by chance, at the same time, he had just moved to Wicklow, and the movers had broken a chandelier, and I was helping him sort out the insurance business. The insurers wouldn't pay. And during the conversation about insurance, he mentioned the Walter Osborne that he bought. And like it passed over my head. And then the next day, the penny dropped, and I called him, and I said, "You didn't buy lot 41? And he said, "Yes, he did." He said, "Oh, well, what's wrong?" Well, I said, "The painting's wrong, that's what's wrong." So, oh my God, what do I do? So he gave me power of attorney, and the matter was placed in my hands. So he had he paid his bill, this painting, which is worth, in my eye, 150 euros. In fact, if it came up in the local auction, I wouldn't pay 150 euros. It's that bad. It's that poor. He paid, short of a couple of shillings, 230,000 euros. Now, fortunately, I heard about it in time. He hadn't paid for it. But as far as Sotheby's were concerned, he had a contract and he was obliged to pay. So what we had to do was to prove that, again, like the gallery, had to prove that they had a Stanley Royal. We had to prove that this was not a Walter Osborne. We didn't have to prove who the real artist was. So the painting, I found it, well, quite an easy task, because I knew the painting well. Before the painting went into Sotheby's catalogue, it had been in circulation in the Dublin market for months. It had been a talk to every auction house and gallery and dealer, and every one of them had turned it down. What Sotheby's are doing, I just don't know. And I don't think that they know either. Anyway, it ended up in their catalogue. And there's a story about the actual bidding, which is probably best left to another time. So I'm going to read something. I was so absolutely convinced. I do have to read this bit, if I can find it here. So I was so convinced, and I really needed Sotheby's to sit up and take notice. So what I did was I wrote to Sotheby's. I said, I want to send this painting to a laboratory for analysis. And I put it in writing that if the result of the analysis shows that this painting is by Walter Osborne, I will write you a check. Me personally, not the vendor. I will write you a check for 230,000 or whatever the sterling equivalent was. So I thought well, it set the cat among the pigeons. This is what they wrote back. On the 3rd of July, 2007, a letter from Sotheby's. It's in my filing cabinet. And I'm quoting, Sotheby's vendor does not want the picture to be tampered with in any way. What they were really writing there is, Sotheby's vendor knows damn well that this painting isn't a Walter Osborne, and he knows you won't have to pay him or Sotheby's $230,000, and he also knows that if it goes to the laboratory, the game is up and he'll be arrested. So the vendor actually, as usual, this is very often the case, a little old lady from the south coast who got the painting from her mother, who got it from somebody who she used to do the washing for or whatever. In fact, it turned out, the painting was actually circulated in Dublin and delivered to Sotheby's by, I better not mention by a restorer, an art restorer in the UK, I'm best to describe it that way. And it seems to me that all of the tampering, or a lot of the later tampering, because this is quite a complex one, because it looks like this painting was actually forged twice, and this one was the second time round. So, I mentioned it, well, actually, I'm going to go back to the others. No, I'm going to go on again. So I mentioned infrared photography earlier, and I checked it earlier from above. So you can see, even from the back row, you can see that after the Walter Osborne is a forged signature, which sits on top of fresh paint, which covers the bottom right handle, the triangle in the bottom right hand of the corner. You can see from the naked eye that the paint doesn't match. Not only does the color not match, the brushwork doesn't match, the texture doesn't match, nothing matches, the luminosity doesn't match. And even without any training or any previous experience with paintings, if I stood in front of this painting, you would say, oh, well, the bottom right-hand corner is completely different. So on top of that added green paint, which jumped out a mile under UV light, we have this very, very nice Walter Osborne signature. But for the moment, I'm asking you just to look at the Walter Osborne signature. Forget about the date. We were able to show that this Walter, again through tracing, that this Walter Osborne signature was worked from a tracing of a signature from a painting called The Potato Gatherers. Again, a painting that was in circulation in Dublin for quite some time. So this is a real giveaway because I've examined literally dozens and dozens of Walter Osborne signatures and compared them one to the other. And it's not just with Walter Osborne, it's with your own signature. You can do it with your own signature, do it in anybody's signature. Every time you sign your name, it's going to be different. It's going to look the same, but when you analyze it and inspect letter by letter, you're going to find lots and lots and lots of differences. And in every Walter Osborne signature, all of the comparisons, lots and lots and lots of difference, except this one. This is absolutely identical in every precise little detail to the Potato Gatherer signatures. So we now know that it's not well, it has to be a forgery because it's sitting on paint, on top of paint that's about 2 years old. So it can't have been signed by Walter Osborne, although Sotheby's expert, believe it or not, a London scientist who runs a laboratory, that was his explanation for the whole thing. He confirmed in his original report for Sotheby's, he accepted that the paint was new, was fresh, but later on, in 2011, when the painting reappears in Dublin, he writes a second report where he states that, yes, the signature is an addition, but it was added by Walter Osborne himself. Yes, it is funny. And the reason that he added it was because he thought it was unseemly that the date of 85 was being hidden by the frame. This is a scientist with a worldwide reputation. People send paintings to this crook from all over the world. And he won't mind me calling him a crook because he doesn't seem to mind. I've written to him telling him he's a crook. It's online, and he doesn't seem to care. Once he gets paid, he doesn't seem to care. So going back to infrared, it's the reason why Sotheby's had to pay us about £20,000 in costs, because of the time we had to spend proving that the painting was not by Walter Osborne. And they gave up just on this one point, just on this little photograph. The painting was in London. We weren't allowed to touch it. We weren't allowed to take any samples, so we couldn't do pigment analysis or anything of that nature. So all we could do was look at the painting. And in fact, they wanted us to go to Sotheby's and look at the painting there. And of course, we couldn't do that because we had our own, at least my people in London had their own specialist equipment, including really, really good infrared photography. So if you can just imagine, just try and blank out the 85. When you look at this painting under normal light, house lights, daylight, white light, call it what you like, all you can see is Walter Osborne. The 85 is invisible, and it's invisible because it's covered by the overpaint. And that's where infrared photography comes in. The infrared layers have an ability, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, to photograph, to penetrate upper layers and photograph things in the lower layers. And it's only under infrared light that you can see this 85. So there's a maxim, which I might describe in, well, let's just make it up. If a painted, painted passage, let's take this as a painted passage, if it's all original, applied at the same time, with the same materials, with the same paints, then it doesn't matter what light, whether it's white light, infrared light, or UV light, doesn't matter. If parts of it disappear, they should all disappear. They should all, each and every part of it should react in the same way, no matter what the light source is. Sotheby's saw it straight away, and they knew the game was up. And as soon as we sent them this photograph with my explanation, that was it. They threw the towel in. They wanted us to rescind the sale. I refused. I said no. They wanted me to write to them with all sorts of things. And I said, no, there never was a sale. There never was a contract. You described a signed painting by Walter Osborne. You didn't sell a signed painting by Walter Osborne, so there was no contract. And anyway, that's only a little aside. That's only the first part of the story. Don't know. No, we can. Oh, well, maybe we go back. Yes, I think. So there is a drawing in. This is a page from one of Walter Osborne's sketchbooks in the National Gallery. So on first glance, this appears to be a drawing for the painting, and in fact, it's even entitled Her Garden, but there are lots of things wrong. There's oceans of the details inconsistent. The size, which is noted on the bottom, is a different size to the actual painting. So it creates a bit of a mystery, but we can see the importance of this drawing. This drawing was later relied upon in an attempt to overturn all of what I've spoken about before, the infrared inconsistencies and all of the rest. So a Dublin auction house teamed up with a crooked scientist, and and used this drawing to overturn all of the previous signs so that it appeared at first, really, so that they could get the painting sold. In fact, all they were doing was trying to clear the egg off their faces. And the Dublin auctioneer, I won't go into the reasons why he had egg on his face. But anyway, quite a good case was made for this confirming that the painting was actually by Osborne. But in fact, one very important piece of information was left out. When we talk about an artist's sketchbook, we imagine that everything in the book is a sketch for one of his paintings. Well, not so. Quite a number of Osborne's sketchbooks started off as books with actual sketches on them, which he would abandon, and then he later took them out and reused them for all sorts of things. But he had a habit. He was a great exhibition goer, and he would travel to as many exhibition openings as he could, and any painting that took his fancy, Osborne would take out his sketchbook, and he would make little sketches of other artists' paintings. And he would also make little sketches of his own paintings after he had painted them. There is a painting recorded in the RHA in 1891, a painting by Walter Osborne as Her Garden. Whether this painting relates to, this drawing relates to the 1891 painting, we don't know. So it seems quite likely that there is a missing painting from 1891 by Walter Osborne with this title, but it's certainly not the painting that was produced by Sotheby's. The next image is actually quite interesting because I mentioned only briefly pigment analysis. So pigment analysis is quite useful in, not all the time, but it's very often useful in identifying a forgery. And normally what happens is you would take a number of samples from different parts of the paintings. You take, these are tiny little microscopic samples, you bind them in resin, and you slice them on a special machine, and then you put that slicing under a very, very powerful microscope. And that's what we have here. We have a photo of some of the pigments from around the signature of this so-called Osborne. These particular, because we weren't allowed to touch the painting, but of course their own expert, their own crooked scientist, he was allowed to cut chunks out of the painting. So these are his cross-sections, one of them anyway. I just took one as an example. And he, you know, you can blind people with science. You know, and this looks very, very impressive. But in fact, his text, the text and explanations that went along with these cross-sections were completely bogus. We wrote to him and we asked for explanations, which he couldn't give because he was found out. But what we did discover, and which we put to him and which he hasn't argued against, is we could see in pigment analysis, you're normally looking for anachronisms. You're looking for, say, French ultramarine, which was first produced in 1928. So if you have a painting which is supposed to be 1850, and it's full of pigment which was only first used in 1928, then they've got a problem. You know? So that's what you're normally looking for, anachronisms. There are no anachronisms here. All of the pigments found in the painting were in use in the 1880s, and they were still in use in 2006 when the repainting was made. So in this particular case, the analysis was a waste of time, with one exception. In this particular section, I noticed that the particles in the lower layer were quite lumpy, whereas in the upper layer, which is the repainted layer, the particles were really, really fine, which suggests that the fine upper layer particles are cheap, so not necessarily cheap, but very modern, machine-made. The less fine particles in the lower layer were probably 1880s, all right. So, we're really only beginning with this painting, but I think what happens next, you're probably not going to believe. So this painting comes back to Dublin in 2011, appears in an auction house, and it's sold, I think it was on the hammer price was 80,000 euros. So whoever bought this, their bill would have been 100,000 or so. And the auctioneer who sold this we had given him full access. He had asked for access, and we gave him full access to all of our investigations, all of our experts' papers, and all of the rest. So in the full knowledge that this painting was an accepted forgery, and in the full knowledge that this international auction house, Sotheby's, don't pay out 20,000 to anyone, and that they don't have to, they went ahead and they reoffered this painting for sale, all on the basis of the drawing that we looked at. And look, I think I'm going to end that particular chapter there because, you know, to go through, it's more or less a repetition, but even worse of what we managed with Sotheby's. So I think I'm getting an idea from all of that. We have probably exhausted our 45 minutes. But let me just touch very, very, very briefly. I will keep this to 1 minute. And in fact, because it would be a shame just to let this opportunity go without touching on this. This is an artist by the name of Nathaniel Hill. Most people here probably haven't heard of him. He's really only known to a couple of academic insiders. And this artist, Nathaniel Hill, he should be one of our best-known painters. This is probably his masterpiece, but this painting was sold, again, at a Dublin auction house, at one stage for 350,000 pounds, as a Walter Osborne, need I add, under identical circumstances to the painting outside and the Stanley Royal, gouged signature, in this case a monogram, the NH monogram, gouged away with a fresh Walter Osborne signature applied. Jan Sheehy, when she wrote her catalogue in 1974 on Walter Osborne, she refers to this painting. She inspected it in the collection of where it was hanging, and she described, what she describes in her catalogue as signature disappeared during cleaning. Signatures don't disappear during cleaning unless they're about 6 months old or 2 years old or whatever. So here we have, try and remember the name, Nathaniel Hill. Almost all, since 1900, almost all of his really fine works have been sold as Walter Osborne's, and he really is an artist to be rediscovered. 10 seconds on the next one, another Nathaniel Hill, sold by the same auction house, gouged signature, and this is in 2009, when I handed one of the directors of this auction house my eyeglass and said, look here and tell me what you see. What I was showing him was the remnants, what he could see clearly, was the remnants of the monogram that had been gouged out. And he turned around and he just looked at me and said, well, I never thought it was Walter Osborne anyway. I know it's laughable. And here again, the same auction house, again, a really, really fine painting by Nathaniel Hill, sold as a Walter Osborne, although to give them their due, on this occasion, they did warn their clients, because they had no choice, because I was sitting there glaring at the auctioneer, they did warn the buyers before the auction that the signature was not original. And my very last image, thank God you all say, is another version of the same painting, another really, really fine Nathaniel Hill. This one survived. This has its NH monogram, and believe it or not, I bought this painting for, I think, £3,000 in a house on Alma Road in Monkstown. It had survived since the days of the RHA, and somebody, I think, and it's the only reason that it survived without being turned into a Walter Osborne, is that instead of turning it into a Walter Osborne, the owners originally turned it into a fire screen. They screwed 2 little feet onto it, and when I took it out of the house, there was a bag of soot behind it. I didn't think the painting could be rescued, but it survived, and it's one of the few surviving Nathaniel Hills. You can see how fine a painting it is. One of the few surviving Nathaniel Hills that still has his NH monogram intact. So, if you do have any questions, you're welcome to fire away.
I'd just first like to say thank you very much to Dominic for joining us this evening.
You're welcome. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Dominic really has just scratched the surface off with his talk this evening about the subject matter. His website is a fantastic resource of a number of stories, some of which he probably couldn't mention this evening. So I definitely recommend you having a look at it. We are a little bit tight for time, so I'm going to just, if there's 1 or 2 questions, or if anyone has any comments or artwork that needs to be evaluated.
Or if anyone wants to shoot me or throw bricks at me.
I think we have 1, 2, and then we'll...
I was just wondering, obviously, fraudulent art has been a massive kind of industry and problem for buyers historically, and I wondered through time, with the addition of technology and a better knowledge of it, has it become less of a problem or more of a problem? And if so, what do you think can be done to protect, buyers and artists the same?
Well, I think if anything, it gets worse. There are more and more and more forgeries finding their way onto the market. And the reason for that is the amount of money that can be made. I took in just recently a painting by, well, not a contemporary, but a painter, maybe Northern Ireland painter from the 1950s, I think, or 60s, he died. So this is not an area I generally deal in. And this was a really clever forgery where some overpaint has been added, and the initials of the artist are gouged into the overpaint. So it looks like it's been signed by the artist in wet paint, which is a really, guilt-edged if you find a painting signed in wet paint. So this is very, very, very clever. I think I know who did this. He lives locally. I think he's been getting away with this, but nobody's challenged him. So I've challenged this painting, and I've said to the people who offered it to me, I said, unless I get the full story of who had this painting before I'm going to hand it over to the police. So I'd worked out, this is a painting that I was on my way to the bank to take out $1,500 in cash to pay for this painting. And I think that more than anything else made me just look a bit harder at it. But I'd worked out that the guy who did that, he's probably, I'd worked out that if he's turning out one of these weeks, he's probably making 75,000 a year, and he's only one local guy. So if you can imagine people operating where they're selling Rachel Rouses for $1.5 million, then that's why it goes on, and the police really by and large don't want to know, because it's so time consuming to get the handcuffs on the guys.
Did we have one more question?
Okay.
Where do you see computers playing a role in actually identifying forged arts? Because a lot of research is being done around actually trying to mathematically compute an artist's style, because we can calculate how they stroke, exactly their movement when they paint. Do you see this being used in the future for?
Well, not just in the future. It's very much in use today, and almost day by day, there's new technology, new software being written. Infrared, the most modern infrared cameras now, the output is all analyzed by very sophisticated software, which gives, if you're familiar with the software, it really gives lots and lots of different ways which weren't available in the past. Yes, it's going to have a very, very, very big role to play, and there are some very, very sophisticated techniques which, well, probably costing many hundreds of thousands. When systems like that become more available, and when the prices come down, won't stop the trade, because the money will drive it. There is a lot of money in it, and it's what's behind the whole forgery trade is money. And as long as money is as popular as it is, we're going to have to live with it.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I think it's been a really interesting and eye-opening talk. Definitely learn the provenance of your art, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back. Enjoy the exhibition. Thanks very much.
Thanks all. Thanks, Ola. Great fun. Great fun.